I think the point you're making, in part anyway, is the future is here, correct?
Well, I believe it is. I mean, we are right on the cusp of ramping up to Revelation, and again, not setting dates or making speculations, but it's later in the game than it's ever had been before, and I see the storm clouds certainly gathering on the horizon.
Well, I do too, but I got to be honest and say that, this ministry, we reach out to individuals, we reach out to pastors, to churches on a daily basis, and the message is, in part, what you're talking about and what you're writing about and what we'll talk about here for a few minutes today. But I got to tell you, and I don't think this is new news to you, it is received by only a remnant. I mean, I would have to say the vast majority of people have little to no interest. They want to live a full life. They want to enjoy life. They are simply not tuned in to sort of what I said was your basic bottom line: wake up, rise up, and look up.
Well, absolutely. I think that most Christians living in America today are content with living the American dream and going to church each week and hearing a nice sermon and going home, going out to eat and that kind of thing, and just living their lives, which obviously is not a sinful thing to want to do, just to live a happy and peaceful life. But at the same time, in the days that we're living in, I think, Jan, that Christians, they're not tuned in to where we are in prophecy. They're not tuned in to what God has said to us. And in fact, it's crazy, but I mean, he wrote a whole book of the Bible specifically to help us get ready for his return and to give us the panorama of the end times. So understandable that prophecy can be hard to comprehend in certain areas, but with a little coaching, I think as we look at this mountain of prophecy, we can climb this thing if Christians will just get their hearts tuned into it.
Well, here's some of the negative feedback I get. The topic is unclear. It's going to happen in hundreds of years from now, perhaps. Again, I can't understand it. It doesn't apply to me. One person wrote to me and said, the beast is not in Revelation. He's in my life, and I live with him every day, meaning her spouse. People have been expecting this forever and ever, and it never happens. And the topic is it's heavily rebuffed, it's heavily ridiculed. And I personally find this tragic because you and I know it's a faith builder. You and I know that it reveals that God bats 1,000% in accuracy as a result of past prophecies fulfilled and future prophecies fulfilled. It gives us hope in perilous times, and I could go on and on.
Yeah, it really does. And I think one of the things that Scripture does talk about is that in the last days, many will scoff at the idea of his return. And that's sort of the spirit of the age right now, sort of this post-millennial Christian, generation that nobody can really know anything. And so it's caused a lot of Christians to sort of dial back their fervency for prophecy. And yet God ended the entire written revelation of God with a book about prophecy and a book to help us. And so I think it's all the more important as we look around at the world, we see what's happening in the world and where we are in history. It should cause Christians to be driven to the Scripture, not to be afraid of it.
Yeah, that eschatology or Bible prophecy, it's exceedingly practical. And Revelation, and I heard you say this in another interview, is God's explanation point of Scripture. It's reminding people that He is in control. And I think that some of us feel, I personally don't, but I talk to people who feel that things are out of control, and to understand that God has things in control, even in spite of terror attacks and you name it, is extremely comforting.
Well, it really is. In fact, that's part of the purpose of the book of Revelation, is that as John is taken up to heaven before being exposed to the furious judgments of God's wrath during the tribulation period, he's taken to heaven where he's able to see the throne of God, and he sees what's happening. In fact, in that one little chapter, there's the word throne is mentioned like 13 times in 12 verses. And part of the reason for that, I believe, Jan, is that it helps us really be resolved of any worry or panic or fear that we might have concerning the end times. And of course, I believe that we're going to be taken up in the rapture before God unleashes his wrath on the planet. But even considering the things that's going to happen to planet Earth, I think that's one of the reasons why God does that. It's just to give us that sense of security and comfort and peace. And that's one of the things that prophecy does for us. It brings that comfort, peace, brings faith, not fear.
You're listening to Understanding the Times Radio. I'm Jan Markell. I'm talking with author-commentator Jeff Kinley. We are carrying his newest book, Wake the Bride, Facing These Last Days with Your Eyes Wide Open. And I'm not often quite as enthused about a product as I am this one, simply because it's so simply written. It is so easy to understand, and it's appropriate if you're a beginner or if you've actually moved on from being a beginner. And Jeff, you said something that kind of caused my head to tick a little bit. I want to just discuss the rapture for just a minute or two, because it is under terrible attack. And particularly the pre-trib rapture is even under greater attack. But let's start with the overall concept for let's take 2 or 3 minutes. The overall concept is under attack. Well, it's not in the Bible. Well, yeah, the concept is in the Bible, but the word isn't in the Bible, etc. It goes on and on and on. How do you deal with that?
Well, and one of the ways that I dealt with it in Wake the Bride, Jan, was I have a whole chapter called Grounding the Rapture, and I wanted believers to know that because I do think that, because of sensationalized movies and even some books that have been written, I think the rapture's really gotten some bad press out there. And, people say, well, it's just a recent belief and that type of thing. So I go back and show throughout history about how the rapture is something, and the imminent return of Christ is something that believers have longed for ages. In fact, the real question to ask is it actually in the Bible? And so that's why we have to go back to Scripture and see what does God actually say about this fact that Christ will return to rescue his bride before bringing retribution on planet Earth. So that's why I devoted 2 whole chapters to the rapture, because I believe very strongly that the rapture will take place. I believe it will be a pre-tribulational rapture. Obviously, that's not a point of fellowship, of division, but at the same time, I believe it is taught in Scripture, and so that's why I put it in the book.
Right. Well, there are patterns in the Bible. There are patterns of deliverance.
Yes.
Noah was delivered from the wrath. Lot was delivered. There were many others. There are actually some books out about this topic. And I think the thing that people maybe don't quite grasp is that we are never spared from man's wrath. That's what the believers in the Middle East and Africa and North Korea and other places are experiencing, man's wrath. But Revelation 3:10 is so clear in that the church is to be spared from the wrath of God. And when you look at the book of Revelation, Jeff, and as you do in this book, and you talk about some of the judgments, I mean, they're unthinkable, they're unspeakable. But that's what the church, the bride, is spared from.
Well, that's a very important point, Jan, because, Jesus did say, in the world you'll have tribulation. The world, they'll hate you as they hated me. They'll persecute me. They'll persecute you. And I do believe, obviously, Christians all across the world right now are undergoing incredible persecution. We've really had it easy here in the United States, and I fear that the day is coming that we may not have it as easy as we had in the past with some of the things that have happened in our government and society and with the possibility of terrorist attacks. But all that to say is we're not exempt from going through hard times or persecution. But, as you mentioned, when God himself unleashes his wrath, it's not meant for believers, ever. We've been spared from his wrath. There's no condemnation for us. And as Paul pointed out in 1 Thessalonians 1, in chapter 5 as well, that we're not destined for wrath, and that we're to be delivered from the wrath to come. So, yeah, the pattern of Scripture, I think, is definitely this idea of taking us out. Another thing, too, is you look at the promise of Christ in John 14 as he calls upon this great betrothal metaphor about leaving the bride and then coming back for her. That we have that promise as well, and, of course, Paul's prophecy in 1 Thessalonians 4. But then, too, just as we look through the book of Revelation, I mean, we have the word church, or church is mentioned some 19 times in the first 3 chapters, and then the word is just
right.
There's 0 mentions of the church until we see the church returning with Christ in Revelation 19, and of course the word church is mentioned again later after that. So I think that even the whole portrayal of the church in Revelation is there for a purpose for us, to let us know that we're in heaven with God's perspective, not on earth undergoing God's wrath.
Yes.